Hi, everyone. It is Monday night. It's time to get started. I think I will be joined by people in just a moment. Um, Tonight, I would like to cover the Elihu material. Elihu was a young man who comes into the scene after all of the dialogues take place, and he says his piece. Before we get started in some of the things in the text that he said, though, I think it's worth mentioning some of the things outside of the text about Elihu, or about the concept of Elihu. Because the thing is a lot of scholars think that Elihu, the Elihu section, which spans from like 32 through chapter 32 through 37, I believe, is really not supposed to be part of the text, that it was kind of added in later. I'm not going to debate whether it was added in later or not. But it's worth mentioning that there are reasons that people think, that scholars believe that it should not, or that it was added later and should not be part of the text. Just for the record, the way I see these things is, I understand that the biblical text has undergone a lot of editing. I know that it's been in the hands of a lot of different people and a lot of different writers. However, I see beauty in that. So while a lot of people will think that the editing that's obvious, or that the multiplicity of different voices might be something that sabotages the text, I think that it speaks of God's beauty, his wonderful ability, that God has the ability to cobble together a multitude of voices over a multitude of cultures, that he can oversee, choreograph, coordinate, orchestrate editing voices, editing skills, that he can add in what he wants at his will, exactly where he wants it to be, and then deliver a message that is beautifully nuanced, is a testament to who he is and how he does, and the process of creation in which he engages with all of creation. All of creation is a process. You are a process. I am a process that God is bringing into an ontological development. It's the scars, it's the imperfections in us on the way, and this is evident in Job, that make us beautiful and wonderful and give us personhood and gravity to who we are. It's what gives us identifying features and marks that we otherwise wouldn't have. If we did not have those things, we would just be robots. His texts, just like the rest of creation, his revelation to us and the way in which he self-identifies to humanity is also marked and marred. But it's his developmental creativity. It's his hands getting dirty in the process of the text that is what makes it beautiful. And I don't think it takes away from it or undermines it in any way. I think that it sets it up and gives veracity to God's project. So some of the reasons that scholars think that the Elihu material doesn't fit in with the text is, or maybe that shouldn't be there. One, it reads like a work from a different poet. It doesn't sound like the rest of the poetry. Two, there's no mention of it in the frame story. Elihu isn't a character that is mentioned in the beginning of the text or the end of the text. The other characters are. It seems like a lesser quality poetry. I think some of this is subjective. Different style may not mean lesser quality. Is the way that Van Gogh paints a different kind of quality than, Chagall, or before that, who's somebody who, like a Rembrandt. Rembrandt is known for being this top of the line quality. But do we say then, with a completely different style, like Van Gogh, is that lesser quality, or is the style itself important? Is the statement found within the type, the genre, the style? Also, many terms in the Elihu section of this text are unique, and they're found only in his speeches, none of the other speeches. So I kind of want to reframe these things, and I've already started with my little introduction. But I think that it reads like a different poet is the point. See, there's a completely different voice here. When Job is dialoguing with his friends speak in this formal poetry that is like formal and beautiful, and it's like a force to be reckoned with just for its literary presence and its literary perfectness. But that's the thing. I think that when comforters come to comfort and aren't so comforting, as happens in our lives, it comes in a certain kind of formality. It comes in a certain kind of hiding behind the text, a hiding behind the veneer. Oftentimes when we come with our platitudes, or when we have been in mourning and in sorrow and in deep pain, and people come with their platitudes and they say all of the formal things, it's not helpful. It's empty. The substance is found in the formality, not in the content of what they had to say, which means there wasn't substance at all. If we were to think of Elihu's role in this story as being revelation, he is the revelation to kind of everything that's going on. Perhaps the message that we get is the voice of revelation sounds different than the voice of the formal mourners, the formal people who come to make you feel better but really don't. That revelation comes in an informal way matters. I'll speak to that a little bit more in a minute. He's not mentioned in the frame story. He seemingly comes out of nowhere. And it appears as though there's a pattern in Scripture. You all can look into this on your own time, but there's a character named Melchizedek in Scripture, who the New Testament, he's actually in the Old Testament, but the New Testament reflects upon Melchizedek and his ministry, and he functioned as a priest. And it says that he came without lineage and had no end. And what it meant is that he kind of appears in the story, and we don't, unlike most of the characters, especially for priests, we don't hear about his lineage and his parents. And we don't hear about what happened after him or who came. Were his priestly sons good or bad? We don't hear that part of the story like we normally do with named priests. But Melchizedek turned everything around. Melchizedek turned the priestly game around, but he comes seemingly out of nowhere as far as like the literary structure goes. And the Bible likens Jesus to Melchizedek. And I think that revelation comes in the form of this like less structured, less formal, and from out of nowhere kind of a sense ability. And it would be very apropos that when God expresses revelation to Job in this text in a literary fashion, that it comes in an unexpected way, that it comes without the lineage and without the formality, and that it comes in this like earthy kind of a way that revelation always seems to come in. This is a mark of authenticity. This is not that the voice of revelation comes differently than the rest of the story is not a mistake. It's not a problem with the text. It can't be put out any different way. Revelation is supposed to sound different from the rest of the voices. The voice of revelation sounds different than our own head games. and then and the head games of our friends. Many of the terms are unique to his speeches. This also is part of the nature of revelation. Part of the nature of revelation is that words are hard to find. It's hard to express what actually is happening sometimes. It's the nature of people who speak on behalf of revelation to almost make up language. Ezekiel did it all the time. I talk about Ezekiel a lot because I'm very, very, very impressed and fascinated with Ezekiel. But Ezekiel almost makes contractions. He forces words together that normally have not gone together to convey his point, to convey his intent. Paul does it. That revelation doesn't come in the old ways of expressing things. That revelation doesn't come in old modes of formality is a mark of authenticity. And that when the voice of revelation comes in the text and it bears these marks, happens upon us, it should be a wonderful surprise, but it shouldn't be a surprising surprise. It should be expected that revelation would sound different. It should be expected that we would be surprised by revelation. It should be expected that the voice of the friends all sound alike. They almost don't have personality or like a developed sense of character. The three friends who come to Job, for all we care, it could have been the same person talking to Job. But because essentially they're saying the same thing. They're making all of their arguments about Job about God's punitive nature and Job's inadequacy. That's the message of everything they had to say. They talked about different elements of inadequacy. They talked about different ways or different terms on which God is punitive. But the whole lens through which they insisted on looking has the same voice. And really, Job can't see things any differently. He intuitively knows, his gut tells him that what his friends are saying isn't true, but he doesn't have a different lens. He just knows that it's not quite right, but he doesn't have a different lens. At the end of the day, he's wrestling with and torn with God punishing him for something, for some kind of inadequacy. So all of his arguments go, God punishes me, I'm inadequate, who does he think I am, why should he care? And he comes up with these creative arguments that are good, they're good arguments with that lens. Why would God do this? He's not just to do this, something's wrong with me, no, nothing's not wrong with me, but it's all the same lens. Elihu, representing revelation, will come with a completely different lens. And a new lens that blows away old paradigms sometimes needs new vocabulary. But another aspect of it is that innovative revelation is counterintuitive, goes against what is commonly held to be true or understood or, fetishized. We oftentimes assign meaning to things based on our own sentimentalities, and we adhere to those sentimentalities when it's not representative of a God at all. But God's revelation shatters those sentimentalities and shatters those paradigms, and oftentimes is just completely irreverent. We'll get to a point in the text here that I was trying to decide whether or not I was going to talk about it at all, but I think I'm going to, just to demonstrate how irreverent oftentimes revelation is. It's supposed to fly in the face of our sensibilities, to wake us up to see a different lens, to look a different way. Another interesting thing is this text starts out by saying, by naming Elihu, and it tells us who Elihu is. It says that Elihu is the son of Barachel, and says that he comes from where? I don't know why I can't see this right now. It's probably right in front of my face. But anyways, what the whole phrase really breaks down to mean is, he is my God. The Son of God has blessed the scornful one from the high clan. So if Job was the scornful one, he's been scornful towards God for this duration throughout these arguments. And he's been respectful / scornful. And he comes from this high clan, and he comes from like pedigree. Elihu he is my God. The Son of God has blessed Job. And this is the new lens. Revelation comes embodied in Elihu, who shows God, demonstrates God as blessing Job. So for this whole time, all of the adversity and all of the suffering has been seen as punishment, as punitive. And Elihu, embodying revelation, is going to show that this is not punitive. This is not punishment at all. This suffering is a blessing. And he is going to spend the majority of his time establishing that idea. He says, I'm young in years and you are aged. Therefore, was I awed and feared to speak my mind with you. That's in verse 6. He has disciplined tact, yet he's irreverent. He understands the customs and he understands his audience. And so while he's tactful, we're still going to see how he's irreverent. His youth, I'm going to say, represents the freshness of the message. It's fresh and it's not bound to the old traditions. It's not bound to old modes of thought. One of the first things that he sets up, like in verse 8, well, this whole beginning part, but we can start to hear it in verse 8 most clearly. He begins setting up the argument that his ideas come from revelation and come from hearing God's Spirit, and that his spirit resonates with what God is saying to him rather than just coming from speculation. If you remember last week, I was saying it would be nice if the friends adhered to having, like, I don't know, arguing from a playbook or arguing from a constitution or arguing from a biblical text saying, like, this is the nature of God and this is why you're guilty, based on something that was reliable and that people knew to be true. But they weren't. They were speculating. They weren't basing it on any absolute truth. They were basing it on the truth as they saw it. And Elihu says, my arguments are coming from a different place. They're coming from a place of revelation instead of a place of speculation. So the irreverence I was going to talk about is in verse 18. And it reads, it's really hard to pick up in our English Bibles, and I'm not making this up. This is something that scholars have talked about. So I'm going to read it from Robert Alter's translation, which comes a little closer to expressing it than some of the other English translations. But in verse 18 it says, for I am full up with words. The wind in my belly constrains me. Look, my belly is like unopened wine. Like new wineskins, it bursts. And it's almost like what's left for you, Job, and what's left for you, Job's friends, after all of this is what's been fermenting inside me and will burst forth. It's like a poetic way of referring to flatulence. And he's like he's insulting them, saying that this is what's left over while I've been sitting here stewing in what you've been saying. And now I'm going to spread this out to you. And the reason I'm bringing that up is just to say that the nature of revelation oftentimes comes against convention and is an affront to our sensibilities. It's the nature of revelation. When it's too glossy, when it's too perfect, when it's too religious, when it's too perfectly packaged in religiosity, it's probably not from God. Let me speak that I may be eased. Let me open my lips and speak out. I will show favor to no man, nor flatter any person. For if I knew how to flatter, my maker would soon take me away. That's in verse 20, 21, and 22. The reason this is important is because Elihu quickly sets up that everything he's going to say has a level of objectivity that the friends did not have. He's not coming here just with his own bias. He's not coming here with his own speculation. He's coming with objective revelation. That takes us to chapter 33. I'm gonna try to move through this quickly, but there's a lot of material. So we're in chapter 33. We're deep into it. We're in around verse 14. Some of the things that I want to point out is in the whole section of chapter 33, the truth of God is not determined by consensus. It is not decided by out arguing the competition. The truth may be hidden from debaters. One of the things that Elihu brings up is that a lot of times what we want to do is we want to go to find out what the consensus is. If everybody believes it, then it must be true. And that's not true. There are times when the church in the Middle Ages unanimously agreed that that astronomy, they had different kinds of explanations for how things worked in the astronomically, and they were wrong, and they held people accountable to how they were wrong. But they were unanimous, except for the couple of dissenters. So being unanimous, having the whole church agree that Job is guilty and God is punitive, does not make it so. And Elihu's quick to make that known. Also, a lot of times we get caught up in this hype where if somebody has a silver tongue, if somebody has an ability, like a rhetorician, can speak better than anybody else and can out-argue anyone else, we tend to think that that person is right, or that person has a monopoly of truth, or that person has like the competitive edge of truth, and that's not necessarily so. A well-spoken thing doesn't necessarily mean that the thing spoken has solid content. So verse 14 says something that's really important. And it reads like this, but I'm going to bring some insight to it. For God speaks in one way or in two, and no one perceives him. In a dream, a night's vision, when slumber falls upon men, in sleep upon their couch, then he lays bare the ear of men and terrifies them with reproof. I don't know. I think in terms of the way the English reads and in poetry, especially with most of our translations, this kind of goes over our heads. But what's being said here is Elihu is bringing more of that new lens. And a lot of what that new lens is about is understanding that what God is doing is not punitive. That's not to say he's never punitive, but that's not the explanation of what's happening to Job here. And he's making the claim that God reveals himself in at least two ways. One, in dreams, or let's say revelation. And two, he reveals himself in reproof. And still, even though we hear him in revelation, we look the other way because it's unconventional. It goes across the grains of our piety. It goes against the grains of our sensibilities. And so we look the other way. No, that can't be true because it's almost offensive. It goes against what we're comfortable with. And also he reproves us, and we don't like that. And we immediately internalize it and think like, well, what he's doing is a sign that I messed up, and I don't think I messed up, so now I'm embittered. God is unjust, God is unfair. But why is suffering attached to God's punitive nature? It doesn't have to be. And Elihu teaches us that. So it goes on to say, starting with verse 16, then he lays bare the ear of men and terrifies them with reproof to make humankind swerve from its acts, to put down pride in a man, that he save himself from the pit and his life from the current. And he is chastened with pain on his couch, shuddering in his bones, unrelenting. His life breath despises bread, his gullet desirable food. His flesh wastes away before one's eyes, and his bones, once unseen, are laid bare, and his being draws near to the pit, his life breath to the killers. If he had an advocate, one spokesman out of 1,000 to declare for man his uprightness, he could pity him and say, redeem him from going down to the pit. I found ransom. The interesting thing, there's a lot here, and I'm going to unpack it here quick and hard in just a second. But before we get there, I just want to say that Jesus later on in the Bible is learned to be the Redeemer. He's learned to be the advocate. He's learned to be the one that saves us from death and from hell. And he's known to be the one who is our ransom. So let me break this down. Reproof. So when we're talking about God reveals himself in dreams, we're talking about revelation. And we talk about reproof. That reproof is there for several things. It's there to reform, and it's there for salvation. It's there to create a change in actions, and it's there for a person to come to a place where he or she can let go of pride. It's there to be a salvation from the pit, and it's there to be a salvation from the current. The current is Alter's translation, and what it refers to is like what was supposed to be thought of figuratively as a river that surrounded death and laid out like the parameters of death. And so it's saying that we don't go onto the turf of death, that we're saved from passing through to the side of death. The next part of that text that I read speaks the chastening and the suffering that's described, speaks of a physical adversity used to bring about the longing for a redeemer. To think in terms of investment, to invest in hope in an advocate, and to creatively come outside of self in longing for a ransom. See, Job has internalized everything. How does this apply to me? What does this say about me? Me, 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 me. Why me? Why me? And this suffering, when the why me's come to an end, gets to a place where we long outside of ourselves. Job always relied on his strength and his wealth and his abilities and his talent to accomplish everything that he had accomplished. And he knows one thing, relying on his own strength, but now he has none. And he longs for help from outside. He longs for the salvation that only a redeemer can bring. He longs for freedom that only an advocate can argue on his behalf. He longs for ransom that he cannot provide. His salvation is going to come from an outside source. And for the first time, he quits looking from inward out and starts looking outward. It's a shift. It's a shift that Revelation, embodied in Elihu, is bringing forth. Adversity is restorative, and it's preservative. It acts as preservation, and it acts as restoration, or it has those effects. Adversity and suffering bring about restoration and preservation. In fact, it can add life. That's what verses 25 going forward are talking about to the end of kind of that chapter. It almost talks about after suffering, if this comes out correctly, we're in a better condition than when we started. It's almost like it adds years to our life. It takes the circles from under our eyes and removes the wrinkles from our skin. Now we're at chapter 34, pushing on hard into chapter 18, or into verse 18. And I have here in my notes, I'm going to read my notes. Elihu is setting up the argument that there is no justice by humans, by human standards. That makes sense. If God made each person, and if each person lacks, and if, I wish I could read my own writing, that would help all of us. If God made each person, and if each person lacks his perfection, thus sinning despite themselves, what good would punitive punishment be? How would adversity seen as punishment or evidence, or how could it be evidence of perfection or lack thereof? How could it be a reliable correlation to gauge what one has or merits? What I'm trying to say here, I wish I would have written that out better so that I could have just read it, but they're kind of notes to myself. Specifically in verse 19, but in this section from 18 through 25, what in part I think Elihu is saying is that we're all made of clay. We're all humans. We all have the same value and worth. We're all mortal. And because we are mortal means that we are not divine. And that we are not divine in itself means that we fall short. So how would God be just in being punitive in our clayness while he is all of everything? And so Elihu is beginning to set up the argument that this isn't based on being punitive. He'll go on to say, like, sure, God will punish people who have gone out of their way to be wrong, but he's not here nitpicking, trying to get you for every little thing that you've done wrong. Because his greatest person and his most perfect person and the worst person, they're still mortal. They still fall short. So why would he pick out every little tiny thing to like revengefully get back, to be punitive, to punish for punishment's sake? There has to be a point to punishment, Elihu is bringing out. And if this kind of line of reasoning is true, he goes on, how can we gauge our worth, our value, how good we are in God's sight based on blessing or based on suffering? Elihu's setting up the idea, much to Job's apparent surprise and much to his friend's apparent surprise, that suffering doesn't equal punishment. And suffering is not a gauge. It's not directly, there's no direct link or correlation to how pleased God is with us. It's the people he loves suffer. And the people he hates sometimes, or the people that are not in good standing with him, sometimes the suffering is not evident, or it's not immediately upon them in as drastic ways as it is for the people who love him. And so Elihu argues that amount of suffering is not evidence of where a person's standing is with God. In verse 33, Elihu kind of calls Job out, and in so doing calls all of us out and says, should he, God, by your dictates mete out justice? Job thought, his friends thought, we think we have this all wrapped up. We know who the haves are and the have-nots. We know who deserves and who doesn't deserve. We view the world and we are self-righteous and we are judgmental and we hold others accountable to our own experiences, to our own wounding, to our own sabotaging, to our own victimization and our own trauma. We hold everybody accountable to our scale, and Elihu reminds Job, and subsequently reminds us all, that's not the scale on which God is working. This is something that's very important. It sounds a little bit different than a lot of what Job is saying, but in chapter 35, starting with verse 10 and working through around 15, 16-ish, or I guess to the end of the chapter, Elihu sets up the argument that God's silence is not punitive, as much as it is a refusal to validate misrepresentation with a response. So this is a very important point that I want to bring up. Oftentimes God is silent. And we think God's silence is that he's abandoning us. We think his silence is, his abandonment or his betrayal or his lack of interest. Here's the thing. When God is silent to a thing, oftentimes the explanation is that he doesn't want to respond. Even when we think that he should be acting out in justice, oftentimes he doesn't respond. And it's because by responding, he validates the very thing that he doesn't want to give any credence to. Try to think of an example. There are times when there's a terrible perpetrator in society, like a mass murderer or something like this, who comes on, and I'll hear on the news, or I'll hear like commentators talk and say, we're not going to name this person. From this point forward, we're not going to name this person, because to name this person gives this person credibility, gives this person fame or infamy, gives this person some kind of like reputation. It gives him too much when he deserves nothing. So we're not even going to name him. There are times when by responding to a thing, we make it a thing. If we were to be indifferent over a thing, then we would be unmoved by it. The opposite of love is not hate, because love and hate take the same amount of emotional energy. The opposite of love is indifference, to not care at all. And there are times where God is completely misrepresented and he just doesn't respond, because to respond would mean there was something worth responding to. But this isn't even worth a response. So he removes himself. He keeps himself silent. He's not even going to respond. Now, there's a problem with this. Sometimes when my kids have been getting away with something, they're doing their chores and they're not doing it quite to the standard that I would hope for them to bring it to, I'll let it go for a few times, hoping that they'll bring correction on their own accord. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes they think that my silence is a sign of approval. Since he hasn't dealt with this, then maybe he's okay with it. That's kind of the downside of this kind of a thing. And sometimes we put that on God. Sometimes we think that God's silence is his approval of the thing, and it's not. It's him saying that, like, it's not even worth my response. This is so mischaracterizing me that I don't even need to respond, that I am unwilling to respond, that I am unwilling to give this thing validity by response. The verses that I'm kind of getting this from specifically are like 13 and 14. Then they cried out and he did not answer, from evil men's haughtiness. But to falseness, God will not listen. And Shaddai will not behold it. All right, moving on, making good time, I think. Chapter 36. Elihu goes on to say some things. I'm going to read some of the verses that I've highlighted. Verse 5 of 36 says, look, God is great. He does not despise us. He's great in power and understanding. In verses 10, 11, and 12, he says, and he lays bare their ear to reproof, and says they must turn from wrongdoing. If they obey and serve, they will finish their days in bounty and their years in pleasantness. And if they obey not, they will cross the current and expire unawares. Okay, probably shouldn't have read all of those together, but verse 5, so I'm going to break them down. In verse 5, it says, look, God is great. He does not despise us. Great in power and understanding. He is reframing everything that's been said and all the old paradigms. He's bringing more of that corrective lens, talking about how God uses his goodness. God uses his superpowers. God uses his greatness and his ability as a blessing. He's good, and he does not despise us. He's great in power and understanding. He's not using all of his greatness to bear down upon us in pettiness. This chapter insists that he is not petty. In verse 10, it makes the claim that when he uses suffering and involves our lives with that suffering, he is not typically doing it punitively, at least not here in Job's case. Job, understand, listening audience, understand that what he's doing is he's reproving so that the wrongdoing is corrected, so that there's self-reflection, like healthy self-reflection, and there's a taking away from self-reflection onto what's outside of me as well, and that I be made aware of how I have fallen short. Job believed he was perfectly fine, and he did all of the commandments. He obeyed the letter of the law, but somehow in all of that, he missed the point. And somehow in all of that, he missed relationship. And in missing relationship, he couldn't be more wrong. And God's not punishing him because he was wrong. God is bringing about suffering so he can come to the revelation and the realization that he needs to right what he would have otherwise never thought of, otherwise would have never come to the conclusion of, otherwise would have never stopped managing his money long enough to consider that there's something else here that's important. Those who learn in the moments of suffering, they will finish their days in bounty and their years in pleasantness. But those who don't obey the revelation, they will cross that boundary, that current, and they're going to expire unaware. It's going to happen quickly, and it's not like God's not out to make them suffer and keep them suffering. They're going to expire. This is it. They're going to come to an end because they didn't learn. They didn't continue on in process. We're at chapter 37. We're almost done here. The verse that I have highlighted is verse 5, and it says, God thunders wondrously with his voice, doing great things that we cannot know. And I have marked out that verses 5 through around 13-ish, 12, 13, Elihu sets up the argument that God is not petulant or capricious. He is ordered and constructive. He uses his abilities for good. And though he manages and maintains the most minute of details, he is not petty. And this verse 37 is correct in ending in speaking of God's glory and his attributes and his goodness and his amazingness and everything that's wonderful. Sometimes, however, in our brokenness, though, we come and read these verses and it sounds like Elihu, as mouthpiece of God, is bragging about God's perfectness and like saying, me big, you small, Job. And that's not what's going on here at all. Elihu is rightly praising God for all of his completeness and vastness and goodness and wonderfulness and everything about him that should produce awe in us. But he's doing it in such a way where the way he describes God is that he's all about order and that he's all about creative productivity and that he's about goodness and that he wants to bring about the best and that he reaches into the imperfectness of our existence to pull out the maximal beauty, because that's his nature. And so while he manages the very minute of details, because he's so utterly concerned with our existence, he's not bearing down on us in pettiness. He does all of this. He invests the goodness of who he is into us for our ontological hope and our ontological development. He invests the goodness of who he is. He invests the creative orderliness of his nature into the ongoing developmental process of our becoming. And Elihu insists on this. which is to end saying that your suffering is not punitive. Your suffering is not a reflection of God as petty or capricious or like a spoiled brat or an underdeveloped, shallow individual. His goodness and his divinity is invested in our ongoing becoming. And so, Job, it's not good enough that you have wealth. It's not good enough that you have peace in the sense that you lack adversity. It's not good enough that you're righteous and perfect in all your ways. You need to become more than what you have. You need to become more than what you like and dislike. You need to become more than your vocation. You need to become more than what you have or manage or hold or impress others with. You need to become somebody while you're naked and while your ribs show and your bones show and your skin is falling off. You need to be a human while you have nothing by which you have measured yourself before. You need to find relationship with me while you have nothing. My perfectness, my amazing attributes, my divinity is invested in bringing about your becoming and your somethingness, your who-ness. I refuse to allow you to just exist. I refuse to allow you to be your shallow, like 9 to 5. I refuse for you to be your shallow impressiveness based on wealth or vocation. I refuse for you to reduce yourself to what resonates with you, what you like and dislike, what you think is evil and good, what resonates with you as good and evil. I refuse for you to reduce yourself to piety, and I will cull out of you relationship with me. And that is the message of Elihu. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good week.